We've covered the Gewehr 88 and carbines in previous episodes. Now let's see how the same action evolved and served unexpectedly on the other side of the Great War. Hi, I'm Othais, and this, ooh, look at that, this rare bird is the Romanian Pushka 1893. Beautiful rifle. Let's get it over the light box. Weighing in at 8 and almost 1/2 of a pound, and with an overall length of 48 and 1/2 inch, this is a fairly big rifle. It feeds 5 rounds through an en-bloc clip of 6.5 by 53 millimeter rimmed, popularly known as 6.5 Dutch. Now, as is tradition, I'm going to have to set this gun down gently because it is immaculate, and we're going to have to rewind and take a look at some previous contextual history. So let's go ahead and talk about King Carol of Romania. Born as a prince of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, I know the Germans hate me, he was recommended by Napoleon to replace the former dominator of Romania. He would be granted the role in 1866 and lead his new subjects through independence from the Ottoman Empire. Now, he would not forget his roots, and so his government would lean heavily towards Austria-Hungary and Germany in, well, a lot of cultural ways. The problem with that, however, is that his population was much more sympathetic to the French and preferred French culture. And, especially with Austria-Hungary, they were pressing an argument over Transylvania. You see, and this is getting into Austro-Hungarian politics, but basically the Habsburgs had to pseudo-split the empire to give Hungary more of its own autonomy, creating what is the dual monarchy. Well, in that process, Hungary therefore ended up with control of Transylvania and would start pushing a pretty severe pro-Hungarian agenda in the majority Romanian state. Obviously, not taking well to the sudden responsibility to oversee the world's most vampire-rich acreage, Hungary would begin a process known as Magyarization. This process was not a friendly or cordial one, and I'm sure a lot of people got hurt, sadly. Now, again, this is a time of rising nationalism based on culture. So, when Romania, newly independent, sees that a predominantly Romanian population in Transylvania is being oppressed by a minority Hungarian government, although they're not minority in the whole scale of their territory, just in Transylvania, that doesn't go over very well, and so the population especially does not like Austria-Hungary. However, King Carol is sending his officers to be trained in Vienna, and they are buying German and Austrian equipment. As a matter of fact, everything about Romania's military forces are geared more towards combating potential incursion by Russia to their east than dealing with any of the mounting problems in the west with the Germanic powers. So this kind of sets us up for that odd schizophrenic behavior of Romania in both wars, where you sort of have this pull between German and other more Entente-style forces of influence. It's an awkward place to be. But, going back to what I said a moment ago, we do need to focus on one thing for this episode, which is that they were buying their rifles from Austria-Hungary. As a matter of fact, that would include the rifle prior to ours today, a Martini produced by OEWG. This was the standard Romanian arm, and they were happy with it up until the French dropped the Lebel 1886. Like every other military force on Earth, the Lebel made the Romanians realize it was time to enter the world of the repeating rifle and smokeless powder cartridge. But being that smokeless powder was so new, and that it was sort of thrust into the world so rapidly by the French that even the French, as we saw in our Lebel episode, didn't get to fully experiment with it, well, there really wasn't a market available of these guns. There was nothing tried and true out there, so they would have to wait. I mean, they put out feelers immediately, but it would take years for some of this stuff to settle into a concrete enough form that A, it was reliable enough to buy externally, and B, what you were getting externally was even available, because anybody that could produce their own were producing it for their home use first. Does that follow? So, as that market started to settle, one of the first things that came out, as we have covered in this sort of now part 4 of 5, is that the Germans had worked up in just 1 year the Gewehr 1888. In designing it, however, they made one key mistake. They stole. You see, they took that one-way only Mannlicher clip system and improved it a good bit by allowing it to load from either direction, making for less fumbling. This was not, however, enough of a departure to escape Austrian intellectual property claims. Mannlicher's patent holder, OEWG, Österreichische Waffenfabrikgesellschaft of Steyr, they would presumably sue. I don't want to overstep my knowledge on this one, guys. I cannot find somebody naming the exact documents that I imagine must be out there. But anyway, OEWG ends up, because of the German theft of the magazine system, with the rights to produce the 88 pattern for external sales, so export. Germany doesn't produce the 88 for other countries. Austria does. Well, OEWG does. Now, they also end up with a lucrative contract to sell 88s to Germany. So they made money on that theft, and they ended up with a new rifle design in their lineup. But when they receive the 88, as much as it's, you know, novel and in some ways better than the Lebel, it's not perfect. And, you know, OEWG has just the two people to improve that gun further. Ferdinand Mannlicher and then factory manager Otto Schönauer. We've already discussed Old Dirty Ferdy in detail, and Otto actually gets a little spot next week, so let's keep moving. These two were to be responsible for one of the smoothest actions ever seen. They would take the 88 and remove all the obvious defects, so they'd get rid of the barrel jacket, give it a full handguard eventually. You're going to see changes to the rear sight. You're going to see a general Austriazation. It's going to look a lot like a Mannlicher in profile and things like that. They'd clean up the clip loading system and improve it just a little bit, especially making it good for rimmed rounds. And they'd come up with a new ejector and extractor system a little bit. And most importantly, they would get rid of that full seal bolt head, which was a huge problem for double feeding on the German 88, because what that meant was that when you first started feeding a cartridge, it did not lip under the extractor. It just got pushed whole body into the chamber, and then at the chamber point, when you're turning to lock, suddenly the extractor clips over the rim. Well, if you accidentally feed one partially, but don't quite close down on it and then rack back and push again, you're going to get double feeds very easily. So all they had to do was do an undercut, and boom, that problem's gone. It seems fairly obvious, and the Germans, like we've covered before, would hit on it later, but at that point it was too late to go changing every rifle in the entire army over one issue that you could train out of the troops. The resulting design would be marketed widely, hoping to tempt the many countries now desperate for a reliable small-bore smokeless rifle. While documentation is sadly lacking, it would appear that at least one of these made it to the US, as we found this presumably early example at the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. It does appear to be the missing link between the 88 and our gun today. Now, because of OEWG and their branding on Mannlicher, these are often, like everything in this family, is considered a Mannlicher rifle today, which is kind of unfortunate, because what we're really looking at when we break it all down is sort of a Mauser, Schlegelmilch, Mannlicher, Schönauer. And that part will come later. So, with that mouthful, I think we're just going to have to stick with the Mannlicher and understand that it's a little bit of a misappropriation / confusing issue, because the real Mannlichers are the straight pulls. Guys, this is hard to unscramble these eggs. But anyway, while they were doing this push on the MSMS rifle. Okay, that's terrible. The Mrs. rifle. While they were pushing that, they did have one interested party fairly early on, as we already know from one of our previous episodes. Again, can you tell as we get halfway into this, guys, that we've actually started covering a lot of interlinking principles? The Italians. The Italians were very curious about this potentially small bore beauty of a rifle. However, they were still proudly Italian, and so this German-Austrian gun couldn't be adopted wholesale. So they'd take the magazine and other elements of the action and pair them with a native breech-loading conversion rifle. If you need to know any more about that, check the link. For those of you who have watched that episode, you will know that the 6.5mm cartridge was in its own way revolutionary. And the Italians weren't the only one to go for it. As a matter of fact, the OEWG company is going to be pushing a 6.5 cartridge of their own along with these rifles. This took advantage of the new understanding that smaller, lighter ammo meant more rounds on hand, and that if you sped it up, not only do you get just about the same power as a larger, slower bullet, but you also have a much longer point-blank range, making it a lot easier on a rifleman to hit where they point. It would find a home, as we will see, with the Romanians, Dutch, and to a lesser degree, the Portuguese. Sadly, I do not have a lot of data on the Romanian trials, but I do have plenty on the Dutch trials. And they are in the same market around the same time. They took slightly longer to make their decision, but they saw generally the same guns and faced the same decision with a reasonably comparable number of men. So we can make a handful of assumptions from both these trial processes and overlay one slightly with the other. They would get a look at the Mannlichers straight pulls, the Remington Lees, the Nagants, the Rubens, and various other fruit. Ultimately, however, both the Dutch and the Romanians would have a preference for, well, this odd clip-loading gun coming from agents of OEWG. In the Dutch case, it was a Belgian man. I'm not sure who was the intermediary with the Romanians. It was probably more direct, though, because they had a line straight to Vienna. But turning back to specifically Romania, this is a very good decision at that time, at that date. I know a lot of you are thinking of guns from that era at this very moment, but if you stop and remember that the only thing that could beat this design at that time was still just out the gate, and that was the Belgian adoption of the Mauser 1889. It's forgivable to not necessarily see the advantages of one system over the other, even though we know that that will branch off into the 98, and there's a whole story there for us to talk about. So, if you take one step back, though, and just go, okay, I'm being offered the German current issue rifle, Germany. Those guys know what they're doing. Only it's been improved by this Mannlicher dude, and I heard he's real smart. And when I get them in my hands and start firing them, they go bang every time. They load faster than anything I've ever seen. They're very sleek and light, and boy, are they accurate. And we can carry a ton of these cartridges, and they still do great damage on these targets we've set up. So, honestly, very smart decision. And so, in 1891, they would order 5,000. In 1892, another order of 3,000. This is sort of like an extended trial partial adoption, and it would ultimately become what is known as the Romanian Model 1892 rifle. Now, I'd like to pause right here for a moment and say a special thanks to all of our viewers, and especially those who have written in to offer us things to borrow in order to film this show. We don't always take everyone up on their offers. A lot of times they're recommending equipment that we are not ready for because we are locked directly into World War I, and we are not going to rehash anything we've already filmed. So if there's already an episode for it, guys, I'm sorry, we just don't need to borrow it. But if there's not an episode for it, and it is World War I, go ahead and drop us a note, because what I do is I take them in as email, and I put them in a folder that I can search later. So basically, as I get around to things and we get sort of lined up with ammo and stuff, I can just say who had what, and then pop out an email and ask if they're still willing to loan it. That's been a beautiful system for us, and it has paid off double today because, thanks to our friend John, I get to say that this is a Romanian Model 1892, a beautiful, near immaculate rifle that is made of pure unobtainium. And I'm very glad to have it as a comparison piece today because there's so little written about these things. But, once again, before I get too far into this particular gun, we need to talk a little bit about some supply issues in Romania as well. You see, ammunition would also come from Austria, as Keller and Company and George Roth handled the first orders. But Romania would begin domestic production in 1895 at These are Romanian words, guys, so you know how good I am at this. Pyrotechnia ARMATEI. Now, this factory did a great job, but at the height of the war that we are going to discuss, they were really only capable of producing 1 round per rifle per day, which made Romania kind of dependent on outside orders. So Romania has 8,000 of a new rifle that is sort of in extended trials. We're going to obviously see that change to a little bit and to get a new adopted rifle, but let's set that aside. We're a year away. Gentle. And let's take this guy and get a closer look at just where the Gewehr 88 has gone. As you can tell, there's more than a passing family resemblance, and we still have a split bridge, cock on open, front locking, flag safety bolt setup with our bolt release here on the side. We have a Mannlichers style magazine, ooh, patented plastic pokey, Mannlichers style magazine, very indicative of that 1895 we'll see later. And remember, the 1890 had already come out. Now, let's walk her back. We have definitely Mannlichers style rear sights. These are extremely familiar to anybody with an 1895 long rifle, although now they're predating that rifle, so you can see sort of where OEWG had things in the works before the Austrian government adopted them. And then we've got this half handguard, and nice long length side mount bayonet, and we have a cleaning rod, no stacking rod. All right, nice tall front sight, by the way. Look at that thing, beautiful. So the real big difference between this and the previous Gewehr 88 is found in this bolt. So let me reach across here, and I'm going to take, again, a Gewehr 88, which, I mean, family resemblance, obviously some big changes in the magazine that we'll see in the animation. Let me get this bolt out of here, and then we'll get this guy out of the way again. And get this bolt out of here. Take a quick look, because there's a couple big differences that you're going to want to see. Right away, you'll notice that this is a fully recessed bolt face. Absolutely has this sort of gas seal ring around it, which meant that when you fed a cartridge, it did not lip up under the extractor like I said before. It had to snap over as it reached the chamber. This caused double feeding problems. This guy, very obviously, allows a cartridge to come up from underneath and then be pushed in. So if you partially feed a cartridge, you can also just go ahead and extract and eject it. The other interesting thing is that this has a very small ejector sort of cylinder set in there that when bumped forward by the bolt stop, pops out and ejects. It's very small surface, not always 100% reliable, and it can gunk up in there real easy. What they did with the Mannlichers rifle is go ahead and put a large sliding lug slash ejector. This isn't actually the lug's underneath there, but this is a big lug cover, and honestly a fairly complicated piece to have over top. Now you'll see milling on the front of this piece, whereas this is square. The reason for that milling is because another problem with the 88 is that you could conceivably have the bolt face detached and then put the bolt back in the gun. The bolt release would still accept a headless bolt, and so you could technically fire a Gewehr 88 without your bolt head, which obviously was disastrous. This gun, if you didn't have your bolt head, the square-faced lug, which actually, if we look closely, I'm not sure how well that shows, actually has a recessed lip, would snag on the bolt stop on the way into the gun, preventing you from actually putting a not properly assembled bolt into the action, which is a beautiful safety feature for that time when people are so unfamiliar with repeaters. Now, as you can tell, these are real improvements, and the Romanians would be mostly happy, let me set that down, mostly happy with their new rifle, except for a few small details that they'd rather see tightened up or cheapened up or what have you. So, in the following year, before they went for full adoption, they would go ahead and request a couple little changes. So, let's get into those now. So, I've got the 92 here, and I always have to read these things, they look so much alike. Oop. Stay there, fine. And, oh god, they're so long, guys. This is the 93. If you got sharp eyes, you might see some differences, but let's help you out. So let's get them both into place, and then we'll zoom on in. All right, this is going to get awkward fast, so just to remind you, 92, good lord, 92, 93. All right, so the big changes are on the outside. I need more hands, gentlemen. The inclusion of a reinforcing rib at the bottom of the magazine to keep it from getting deformed easily. And you can see this nice long finger rest that's now milled into the stock. There was added to the front, and I guess I don't need the other rifle back to remind you of this, but now we have our stacking rod, and we still have our cleaning rod, but it's no longer sticking up enough to act as a stacking rod because I'm sure that was a very flimsy arrangement. Let me walk this back. On the rear sight, and this actually would go back and forth, on the rear sight, there's a reinforcer here that is set for 1,000 meters. That was added in addition to this one, but I have heard that people have found later production 93s, it's gone, it's back to this setup. So it looks like it was this, that, then this again. And the big difference between these two actions is going to be found in the bolts. So let me go ahead and get them clear. So we have our 92 like before, and we have our 93. Let me get these big rifles out of the way so that I don't scratch or dent anything. These are extremely rare and in extremely good condition. There we go. Pulling these back into view, sorry guys, they're very similar. This is our original, this is our improved. There's gonna be a number of changes on the bolt. One, right away you can see that this sort of reinforcing lug is gone. It was just sort of a stiff guideway path, unnecessary, milled away. Two, the huge changeover between these two is going to be the ejector, which is no longer on the bolt at all. We have the shape here to prevent from having a bolt headless bolt going into the action, but there's no ejector functionality on this particular bolt. Instead, it has been moved into the rifle itself. So you can see this little, there, that little guy right there, that's our ejector. So if I take this bolt and set it into the action and then pull it to the rear, she tips up. Pick. That is now our new ejector. The Romanians preferred that to having this floated and potentially damaged piece right here. And honestly, I can't really argue that's not the worst idea in the world to just go ahead with something simpler like this, and honestly easier to fabricate and replace in the field if it does happen to get damaged. So this would be the final design for the Romanians, and large orders would follow. Production would start, deliveries would start, and that leaves us with a good time to go ahead and take in an animation of just how this gun works. Just like last time, we'll load up 5 rounds from our end-block clip and take a look. From the inside, this gun should look a lot like the Gewehr 1888. But aside from our bolt head and ejector, that magazine should also stand out. Note the improved follower, using 2 lifting arms and 2 leaf springs instead of the Gewehr 88's coil spring and plunger. The safety is the same flag type as the 88, blocking the cocking piece. Alright, let's let Mae have a turn. Man, what a beautiful rifle. Service aside, this is probably the most gorgeous gun of the war, in my opinion. But anyway, just by the way, for anybody curious, those clips we used on the range, they are not Romanian originals. In fact, they are Dutch. You see, the Netherlands ultimately settled on the same general action as the Romanians, albeit with different sights and a wide variety of stocks and configurations. After we clear World War I, we'll try to come back around to these as they are some of my favorite rifles. Anyway, they use the same 6.5 by 53mm rim cartridge, and the clips are interchangeable with the Romanian rifles. And Dutch clips are easier to get. No big difference, guys. Speaking of accessories, the guns came with a 10-inch bladed bayonet based on the German 7184 pattern, albeit with an Austrian M95 sheath, likely there to ease manufacture by OEWG. So now the Romanians have their infantry rifle. A beautiful, I know I keep saying it, I'm sorry, it's gorgeous, beautiful rifle. So, that's it, right? We're all good? No. As you've watched this show, I think we all seem to have realized that unless you have a universal short rifle, these things come in pairs, because ultimately you've got guys with horsies and they don't want something this big on their backs. And so the Romanians would also have to stop and take into some consideration the idea of adopting something less than this big. And in April of 1894, they would go ahead and order 14,000 shortened 1893 actions, a Mannlicher carbine. Now, those guns are extremely rare. Maybe not quite as rare as the 92 that we had today, but still so rare that it's extremely difficult to potentially get one on this show, which is why I'm proud to say that this is the Romanian Mannlicher 1893 carbine. Guys, you are killing it with sending us the best stuff. Let's get this to the light box. Weighing in at 7 1/4 pounds and an overall length of 38 1/2 inch, it's delightful. It uses that same 5-round 6.5mm end block clip. Now, I've seen it written that these guns were ordered in 750 unit batches with a serial prefix that was associated, ABC, with whatever cavalry unit they were with. If that is true for the initial order, it didn't hold for long because just sort of observing the serial numbers, it all sort of goes to pot later on. But neat story, it might hold up, but trying to get enough of these together for a survey is kind of rough. But anyway, this gun, along with its long rifle brother, would enter Romanian service and then, frankly, sit around for a little while because there wasn't an immediate conflict for them to parade into. Instead, they'd ultimately, sadly, first be used against the Romanian people. You see, in February of 1907, Romanian peasants suffering under incredible rent increases on arable land owned primarily by the wealthy revolted. First, they would resist signing the leases, but fear about possible starvation without work would make them angry. This made the landowners flee, which left those leases still unsigned, and further panicked the peasantry. The situation cascaded out of control, and the government would step in with 140,000 soldiers in late March. Sadly, they would also open fire in attempts to regain control. The one silver lining in that conflict is that it did lead to caps on the price per acreage of leased land, and they set up sort of a banking system to help peasantry buy land that they could farm on. Look, that has its own history and politics associated with it, guys, and we are sort of more aligned with conventional warfare. So, on that note, let's take a look at conventional warfare. In June of 1913, Bulgaria would attack its former Balkan allies in a disagreement over territorial claims following their shared war against the Ottomans. In July, Romania, also agitated by Bulgarian territorial claims, would use the opportunity to declare war and attack their undefended front. They would ultimately advance with ease, only taking casualties to disease. This conflict would draw the Ottoman Empire in as well, prompting the Russians to threaten war and the British to desperately intervene. Some believe it could have started World War I a year sooner. It certainly was a sign of things to come. In this conflict, the Romanians would field 470,000 men. Unfortunately, they had 270,000 rifles and 30,000 carbines, so that left them a bit short, and they'd have to turn rather quickly and with a cash in hand buy now kind of attitude to Austria-Hungary, who could not obviously just sort of pop these out of nowhere in no time flat. Instead, they'd have to buy Mannlicher straight pulls that were already sitting around. They would snatch up some 60,000 Model 8890 and 95 rifles, chambering the 8x50mm rimmed cartridge. The expectation was that they would remain in the rear echelon roles, which was kinda easy in the Second Balkan War. But by World War I, these were still in inventory, and they tried to relegate them to gendarmerie, engineers, and fortress troops, but of course that only lasted so long, and many would be later found on the front lines. Following the Second Balkan War, the Romanians would order another 200,000 1893 rifles and another 30,000 carbines. This would help restock their standing army. In addition to that, they would need more ammunition, and this time brought in 3 more manufacturers. Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabrik, Hertenberger Patronen, and Manfred Weiss of Budapest. Alright, we're kind of wandering a little bit further into the history, and I didn't want to just sort of double up 2 May bits at once. Let's take a break though, and actually get a closer look at this carbine right now. I'm sorry it's a little awkward and out of order, guys, but staggering this just right is such an odd task. So, zooming in, we will see that this gun is much smaller, that it does not have provision for bayonet lug or stacking hook. It would have had a cleaning rod, however that's been lost to time. And I should say that at some point, bayonet lugs will appear on some of these carbines. We're not sure which order. I saw some comments and some speculation, but I just couldn't pin it down. I just know some have been found later modified to have this lug, although it appears that they came from OEWG that way, so it's probably some later contract that we just haven't picked up in the notes. Now, looking at the rear sight, obviously this is going to be really reminiscent of that Gewehr 91 Car 88, although we don't have that flip up and down battle sight. And then, at the rear, we have a turn down bolt handle. And that's about it in terms of differences from the long rifle. Alright, well, there's no real reason to animate this because it's the exact same mechanism. So we'll go straight to May and let her get a few shots down range. You know, I think in these past 2 episodes, we've really been spoiling May. But, let's get back to the task at hand. Now, I said before we cut away that they would order 200,000 long rifles and 30,000 carbines, but what was delivered was about 103,000 rifles and all but 500 carbines. You see, there was a little bit of a problem with the delivery schedule because, as we now know, war were declared. And with the start of the war, the dual monarchy, in desperate need of arms, would ban exportation from OEWG. Instead, they would seize all the arms for themselves. Now, from the Romanian contract, there were 90,000 plus outstanding. 82,000 of those were either already assembled or near assembly, and so those were taken in by Austria-Hungary. Now, many of them were in their original 6.5mm chambering, but they would also take, probably from the ones that weren't yet already assembled, or even, I guess, some that were fresh off the line, they would take them and convert them to 8x50mm rimmed, which the action was more than capable of withstanding. We've already seen this cartridge in our episode about the 1888-90 and 1895 straight pull Mannlichers, and now we're just feeding it through a different and possibly better rifle. To accomplish this, the barrels were bored out to the new cartridge. The magazine was extended slightly downward, the ejection port was increased in length, the sights were altered from up to 2100 meters to 2600 Schritt, and the handguard was milled down the center just a bit to open up that sight picture. These guns would actually serve well and were prized by Austrian soldiers who found it smooth, reliable, and light. Production, however, was not continued as OEWG focused on the standard 1895 straight pull, so only 82,000 or so would serve, likely becoming slowly more scarce as the war progressed. Those 8mm converted rifles are extremely scarce, and in all honesty, I do not have one today. That was one of the few that we could not turn up for this episode. We did, however, manage to photograph the earlier example over at Springfield, so special thanks to them for at least letting us at that. Now, that means that at the beginning of the war, the Romanian rifle is already in the thick of it, but Romania is not. King Carol would actually pass in October of 1914 and be succeeded by his nephew Ferdinand, who had promised to serve as a good Romanian, despite his Germanic birth. Still, the country had a German king and a populace in support of the Entente. This meant the easiest course of action would be one of neutrality, for now. In the meantime, then Colonel Vasile Rudanu was dispatched to shore up the gaps in Romanian military equipment and arms. He was charged with finding at least 100,000 more rifles and 50 million rounds of ammunition, along with other supplies like grenades and field kitchens. Visiting Austria, he hoped OEWG would be able to produce more rifles and that Roth and Keller would turn up some more ammo, but he was turned away empty-handed. The dual monarchy wasn't going to be arming neutral powers of questionable allegiance, it seems. Now, the Austro-Hungarian government would offer 8,500 rifles in exchange for 500 fuel tanks. These would be rail, I'm going to be able to make ours, like train car-sized fuel tanks of gasoline. Obviously, Romania wasn't really big into this deal. They also turned down a deal for some unspecified amount of ammunition for 300 fuel tanks. Apparently Austria-Hungary wanted fuel tanks. Anyway, instead, the mission would try to go over to other commercial manufacturers in Vienna and back home in Bucharest. They tried to establish more production just to see if they couldn't scrape 20,000 more rifles. And these efforts, again, failed. So ultimately, if Romania wanted to be rearmed, they would have to turn to the Entente. They eventually managed 10,000 Berthier 0715 rifles from France. More would follow later on. Ammunition, however, would be had from Kings Norton Metal Company of Birmingham, Société Française des Munitions Paris, Società Metallurgica Italiana in Livorno, and the U.S. Cartridge Company of Lowell. Oh, the American one couldn't be easy? Well, that's nice and all, but it's a token amount for what was realistically needed. And now you have Romania sitting to the backside of the Central Powers in an ideal position to attack. And the Entente are baiting them into action. They are making outlandish promises to attack Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. They're saying that Russia will secure Dobruja and that they'll be able to supply 300 tons of supplies a day if the Romanians would just get in there and throw that last punch. The war would be over. Come on, Romania. It's going to be fine. Don't worry about your complete lack of supplies or ammunition or rifles. This is going to be a good thing. Trust us. Well, what the heck. In August of 1916, Romania entered the war on the side of the Entente, and it caught the Central Powers off guard. Victories were swift for a short while. They would enter the campaign with 370,000 or so M93 rifles and 60,000 carbines, making for a total of 430,000. Unfortunately, they had 800,000 mobilized personnel, with roughly 480,000 combat troops, so that means they had to lean on their reserve arms. This included 40,000 Mannlicher 1888-90 style guns and maybe some 95s, about 111,000 Martinis left over from the old days, and that sweet deal for 10,000 Berthier. Now, if you want a full history of the Romanian campaign, you're going to need to do some reading. If you want a decent history of it, then I recommend the Great War. We do not have the time to go into the nitty-gritty. But the short story is that Romania got in a good one too before Germany and Austria-Hungary, facing static war on the other side of their empires, said, hey, we can start moving some of these reserves. And boy, did they hop on some train cars and take a short trip across the countryside and start pounding the crap out of the Romanian lines. This became a problem because all that promise of support from the Entente melted away like so much butter. And instead, you have Romania, with some help from Russia, sitting in the east, dealing with this now massive mobile front. And to their credit, the Romanians would tie down a numerically superior enemy for much longer than they had any right to. It's frankly impressive, but it was untenable. They did not have internal supplies. They could not be re-equipped from Russia very easily because Russia was having a hard time equipping itself. It was a complete mess, and shortages were absolutely common. And so there were extreme measures in place trying to keep rifles on the front line. In fact, some 123,000 Italian VEDEREA Vitali black powder repeating rifles would be acquired. These were not ideal, but beat being unarmed. Russia would also provide roughly 42,000 additional captured Austrian Mannlichers, 88, 90s, and 95s. And in the spring of 1917, the French would send a military mission to help rebuild the Romanian army. They would ship 110,000 Berthier 0715 rifles, but only 87,000 would arrive. It seems, being delivered through Russia, some of them were seized by rebel forces, a sign of things to come. These efforts were still not enough to completely rearm Romania, and now introduced the problem of a desperate mix of supplies for ammunition. You do not need a logistical nightmare on top of an actual nightmare, gentlemen. So, Romania was up something creek without a paddle. Anyway, in addition to shortages of guns, they would also face shortages of just about everything else, including horses. You see, the cavalry had to give up their horses in order to keep the artillery moving. That's whatever horses were left. And so those guys would have to take their little carbines and walk around on foot as impromptu infantry. However, these things don't take a bayonet lug for the most part, discounting the contract for some that apparently existed, probably gendarmerie. Again, that's one last little mystery in this puzzle. But the cavalry guys, they did not have bayonet lugs. And so it created an unusual situation where some of them were actually on foot carrying a carbine and a lance so that they'd have something to melee with if they had to. Because again, ammo shortages. So Cavalry Captain Othais would suggest a solution, an ersatz bayonet to fit over the muzzles of the carbines. 20,000 or so were produced, made from 1867 Russia Krinka rifle bayonets. They had a blade length of some 15 inches, and although crude, could still poke a hole in a dude. Now, despite their best efforts, the Central Powers were not able to sucker punch Romania out of the fight. Romania fought hard and stayed upright, and you guys can tell it was a complete mess. So it's very impressive that they made it until October of 1917, when revolution racked Russia and it collapsed into itself, which meant that Romania was finally absolutely alone and almost impossible to resupply. At that point, they had to sign an armistice in December, and then that would follow with a punitive Treaty of Bucharest in May of 1918. This placed Romanian grain and oil into the war machine. Many believe the net effect of the Romanian campaign ultimately only served to fuel the Central Powers longer. And realistically, in terms of World War I fighting, that was the end of Romania and the end of the discussion of these guns in World War I today. However, just to give some more context, I will say that with 1 day left in the fighting in the war, Romania would re-enter the conflict again on the side of the Entente. And during the armistice, because it wasn't a guarantee that there wouldn't be another breakout of war, the French would go ahead and reinforce Romania with 60,000 more Berthiers through the Danube army. Now, these guns, again, not World War I, but they'd come in handy because Romania would immediately enter into another conflict. Basically, Hungary refused to release any more land post-war. The government would resign, then communists would take over. It's a whole story that we really don't need to get into today, but I recommend looking up the Hungarian-Romanian War. Obviously more fighting, and ultimately the Romanians would occupy Budapest. I would actually try for a little more detail on this conflict, except for the fact that by then these guys were almost completely depleted. If you look at photos of that war, you're almost always going to see French or Austrian equipment and not these Romanian contract guns. They were pretty much done for by the time Romania got caved in by the Central Powers. So, technically, this would remain the primary infantry arm of Romania on paper, despite being outnumbered, until the mid-1920s, when they would adopt the Czechoslovakian Mauser VZ-24. Heading into World War II, there would still be some of these guys in inventory and potentially issued to rear echelon troops. I've also heard stories of cavalry units still carting around these little babies, which honestly, who wouldn't want to, in the very early days of the war, but ultimately these guns were displaced and barely represented in that conflict. What few were still in inventory were definitely removed during the communist occupation post-World War II. So that makes these mostly a one World War rifle. Alright, so that wraps up Romania, and it's probably just about that time to go get Mae's opinion, if it weren't for the fact that we have left out an entire involved, active fighting nation of World War I that also issued this particular action. And that would be the Portuguese, who had the, boom, Mosqueton 1896. Let's get it over the light box. This short rifle variant is 43 1/4 inch long, weighing in at 7 1/2 pounds. It feeds the same 6.5 ammo and the same end block clip. That's right everyone, Portugal has officially joined our party on this show. I'm sure a lot of you are happy now. That means though that I have to mention by law the Kropatschek. This tube-feeding black powder rifle was once one of the most advanced repeating designs of the day, until just months after its Portuguese adoption. Yep, not only did the Lebel ruin its lead, it also stole its magazine system. Which kind of put Portugal in an awkward position. They had just re-equipped with what was then the latest technology and were suddenly blown right out. But only by the cartridge. You see, their overall action was still great, and technically strong enough to handle a smokeless cartridge. There's a whole history there that we're going to talk about later, and as part of this show, because Portugal has a role in World War I. Now, here's the problem. You have this gun, you've adopted it. You adopted it and ordered enough. And then you find out you need some more, okay? You've got some cavalry, some naval troops, maybe some artillery troops, and they need something that isn't a full-length rifle. And you do have short rifle and carbine forms of the Kropatschek, but you'd have to go back and have OEWG retool up and produce them, which is extremely expensive when they've moved completely away from that product into this new smokeless era, because we're talking about the mid-1890s. We are far from producing a new black powder gun. So, what do? Okay, well, your options are really try to kick somebody in the pants and pay a lot of money to build the old gun, or you can go through the whole adoption process to get a new gun and re-equip your entire army around it, which is also very expensive just to take care of these troops. Or you could take a look around and realize that OEWG has a current export model that would be the equivalent of what they were hoping the Kropatschek would be, and they can produce it rather cheaply in the small numbers that you need because the tooling's already there. And so they'd go with that option. In 1896, they would order something in the neighborhood of 4,000 short rifles, likely all for naval use, and an additional 4,000 carbines for the cavalry. In 1898, another 4,500 carbines would be ordered for the artillery troops. They will all display the crest of King Carlos over the chamber area of the receiver. Now, the Portuguese carbines are virtually identical to the 1893 carbines, so there's nothing to be gained from tracking down and shooting one of those. But the short rifle, well, that's kind of interesting because it splits the difference between these two guns here. You know, the length is in between, the rear sight ladder is kind of in between, and overall the rest of the action is the same. So, let's go ahead and get this in Mae's hands and see if she has a different opinion about this from those. Alright, I want to be a little candid here and say that we've been trying to pull ahead in production, so we filmed all the Lees and all the Mannlichers on the same day. So poor Mae was standing in one fixed spot for something like 6 hours. So everybody give her a little applause on that one. It was brutal. I know it sounds fun, but at a certain point, after take 3 of something, anyway, so these guns were kind of unique in military history because they were adopted as a stopgap. And they were not chambered in the primary cartridge of the Portuguese Army, Navy, whatever. And then they were immediately, well not immediately, but in 1904 they'd be replaced with the VEDEREA, which did not use the same cartridge again, and is another gun that we are actually going to talk about in this show. So they ultimately are sort of self-obsoleting and would be stuck in, you know, sort of rear-end naval duty and also sort of get shunted down to colonial troops, which actually weirdly makes them more interesting for us today because that puts them in Africa. That means they were in the hands of forces like those who landed to assist with the problem in Angola. Here, German and Portuguese colonial forces would fight a number of smaller battles, ultimately displacing the Portuguese until the British in turn pushed out the Germans. Following these conflicts, the guns would further be used to suppress local uprisings, with natives armed with apparently leftover German equipment. Anyway, these guns really didn't hold the line after that. Instead, they'd slowly peter out of service in the 1930s. And what remained in inventory were actually converted to sub-caliber training rifles, which are not uncommon to find today. Well, maybe a little uncommon, but more common than, say, a mint condition one of these guys, because most of them look like they've been dragged behind a truck. I guess that's what happens when you spend a lot of time at sea or in Africa. Anyway, now that I've cleared Romania, and I've cleared Portugal, and we made brief mention of the Dutch rifles, even though they are slightly different and deserve their own episode, that almost wraps us up, except for the fact that there would be 2 more homes for the Mauser, Schlegel, Milk, Mannlicher, Schunauer rifles. You see, in 1904, OEWG hadn't seen many more orders for these guns, but still had the tooling set up and spare parts on hand. So they would slightly simplify and rechamber to 7.92 by 57mm, feeding from a Gewehr 1888 clip, and market it as the Model 1904 Export. 2 interesting buyers would emerge. 1, the Chinese, and 2, the Irish, who obviously hang out together all the time. Now, the Irish specifically were formed around the Ulster Volunteer Force, who were trying to arm up in case of home rule because they were a predominantly Protestant organization that really didn't like the idea that the Catholic majority might start telling them what to do. I'm sure you guys are aware that Ireland has had a troubled history with this sort of thing. So it's no surprise that they would want to smuggle in 10,000 rifles or so. Interestingly, from the UVF side of the fence, the Great War would diffuse that particular situation. Obviously not on the Catholic side, that's another story. And those guys would mostly join up with British forces in the war, and as they volunteered, some of them would turn in their rifles, which meant that Britain had some of these things available for drill and training. But mostly that just diffused that situation. So instead, let's turn over to China and talk about the fact that they had already adopted the Gewehr 1888 out of Germany as their standard rifle and were producing it in their own country. And then they would go ahead and import some of these OEWG-made 1904s. How curious that just after purchasing these kissing cousins of their standard rifle, the Hanyang 88 arsenal would modify the Gewehr 1888 into what is known as the Type Han, with an unjacketed barrel and wooden handguard. Boy, I wonder where they got those notions. And with that, we have truly reached the end of this episode. I know there were a lot of twists and turns, but I hope everyone now has more of an appreciation for one of the more obscure designs of the war. Well, at least obscure in memory, because honestly, the 88 had proliferated worldwide, and yet it seems like it goes unrecognized. So I really hope that this helps with that. Now, all these guns are spectacularly rare, as I said. Maybe the Portuguese would probably be the easiest to turn up, but Good luck on Romanians, guys. Thank you again, John, for loaning these to us, and let's go ahead and turn to Mae and get her opinion on firing these rifle forms of Bigfoots. All right, we've rearranged, and now we have Mae, and we're going to get her opinion on the Romanian and one Portuguese Mannlicher rifle. So we've got a family to deal with here. So let me go ahead and hand you this long rifle.
Thank you.
And then we also have a Portuguese Mosqueton, short rifle, and we also have the Romanian carbine. Let's do this a little bit more unusual. Let's sort of walk it backwards from long to short. So give us an ergonomic overread of the long rifle, if you would.
So I guess in this situation that would make this guy Papa Bear, but I certainly hope I'm not Goldilocks. Anyway, first I definitely wanted to mention briefly, this gun looks gorgeous. I mean, it looks like someone took it home from the arsenal and just kept it in great condition from there. So nice job, John. Anyway, next things next. It is actually really heavy. I wasn't anticipating that. Yes, it is a very long gun, so there does come a little bit of extra weight with it, but for how thin it is and how it looks, I didn't expect it to have this much heft to it. It's a lot denser than what I anticipated. I don't care, again, for straight wrists. I've mentioned that before. It just doesn't give me enough purchase down here for my grip. Comb wasn't bad. It was high enough. I was able to get a nice good cheek weld on there, so that was important. The action... Nothing going on. When nothing's actually in here, it's incredibly smooth, and we'll get to this a little more in the firing section. I don't want to go into too much detail just yet, but it wasn't as smooth as I was expecting when firing on range. But in terms of ergonomics, gorgeous, but definitely some little surprises there.
All right, I feel like the ergonomics part, plus some recoil, is really going to be our big difference between these actions. Would you agree?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so let's just sort of quickly walk through the other two. So I'll take that for a moment.
All right.
Although, I guess I did this in the wrong order. Okay, here is our Portuguese Mosqueton.
Okay.
Now, that's our short rifle. This is our long rifle. Is there anything outstanding about that, just in terms of fit and feel, that we need to know about?
I mean, yeah, this guy, he's shorter, so he's definitely lighter, and I'm able to get the muzzle up faster, which is nice. The sight radius is okay, but I feel like they could have walked the rear sight a little bit further back to help me out there, but it's not terrible. Now, I will say that this guy is in rougher condition than the other two that we shot for this episode, so this is kind of what you're going to get in that kind of situation, I feel. So you see the actions actually, it is stiffer than what I would have liked. So ergonomics-wise, it wasn't bad. It was actually kind of what I needed more from that guy.
All right, that's 2 out of 3. Let me make some room here. There we go. And... I'll go ahead and hold you that.
Okay.
And while I have it for a moment, we're talking about length. So this is what we see with a lot of long infantry rifles in World War I. And then a few countries, like the US and Great Britain, would go with a standard short rifle, a 1903, the short magazine Lee Enfield. This gun is really in that sort of size category, although that's not how it was issued or used. But holding on to it in this intermediate size, this feels about right to me for what was the sort of advanced concept of that day. But we've got one more to go, which is the handy-dandy, nice and tidy carbine. So why don't you just give us a quick walkthrough about how you felt about holding that?
I mean, obviously, even lighter and even shorter, so yeah, that's not a bad thing. However, this sight radius, what's with this? Like, they totally could have walked this rear sight further back. That's unnecessary to put it that far forward. So yeah, I hate this sight radius even worse. Turn down bolts, I've never been a fan of them. I just feel like you're never really able to get a good finger under there. Luckily, this one is sticking out far enough that it's not terrible. It's not the worst one I've had so far, certainly, but it's still just not my favorite. And last but not least, we haven't gotten to it yet, but I want to go ahead and start talking about the recoil a little bit while I've got this guy in hand. The recoil with handling the carbine actually felt best. Like, it felt like it really matched the gun. 6.5 Romanian came out of this, kind of felt like 8mm coming out of a Gewehr 98. It just felt like they were meant to be together. Whereas when I was handling the long rifle, it felt like basically I was shooting a .22. It was nothing. So yeah, this one definitely had its perks.
Yeah, I can agree with that. You're talking about, it's a potent 6.5 millimeter cartridge. I wouldn't go as far as a 22, but it's true with a lot of the stuff we've handled where you're pushing 8 millimeter label out of a carbine shorter than that. Okay, we've started to get used to this sort of like high recoil environment. So I agree, I pick up something like this long rifle and shoot 6.5 out of it. And I can understand why when you saw performances on how these cartridges impacted targets being reasonably similar to an 8mm or a 9mm or something like that, I can see why you go, well, why don't we just go with that one? It's so much easier to shoot. We get almost the same effect or maybe even a greater effect. Like, these small bores make a lot of sense from the trials committee's perspective at the time that they were adopted, when you really start playing with how simple it can be to work with them. And plus you get to carry more ammo and yada yada. We've talked about all this. So I guess we need to talk about shooting the guns. I don't imagine that there's a big difference between any of the triggers or overall, we've already talked about the recoil difference. The sights are roughly the same except for you sort of walk through the sight radius. So what I'll do is I'll ask you to do this. Let me hand you, instead of wasting everybody's time and trying to break down the same gun multiple times, let's talk about just the short rifle. And you mentioned that that's a slightly more worn action, so I'll invite you to sort of compare the performance with that short rifle action and then like this pristine mint condition long rifle right here. Let's just get your view on the key differences between those two.
Okay, first things first, we're going to load in the M-block, and honestly, I do prefer the M-block system. I really do, just not having to strip them off anything. They're all set in there in a nice, neat line. I feel like that really is just the better system in my book. Feeding the first round, you know what, honestly, the Portuguese, it did great. It fed all the rounds, didn't give me any snags or problems, whereas the Romanians, you could honestly see from the video, I did have some snagging issues where I would try to chamber around and you could see it actually just dip down a little bit. And I had to learn to do a double pump because if I tried to force my way through, it would dip down further. Pulling it back actually allowed the round to pop up just enough that I was able to shove it all the way home. And seriously, if I think about the problem with that, I want to say it's that rim on the cartridge. Like, seriously guys, get rid of that rim. It's not necessary. Next up, lining up the sights, all three across the board. The sights were tall, they were great for their time, but like I said, as we went from Papa to Mama to Baby Bear, the sight radius consistently, of course, got worse. Yes, shorter rifles, but I feel like they just kept edging it further up, whereas they could have brought the rear sight a little further back, giving me more. But beggars can't be choosers, I suppose. And the triggers, all three across the board, were actually really nice. They were good, smooth, two-stage triggers. No real surprise there, so I thoroughly appreciated that. Then after firing, trying to pull the rounds out, or trying to eject a round, on the Portuguese, it just kept snagging. Like, it just kind of felt like it was really rough. Like, honestly, I think the biggest problem was that, unlike with the Romanians, the Portuguese is actually not in the best condition. So I feel like over, like, just 100 years of wear and grit getting here in the action, it just caused it to become rougher. So honestly, I could see why Mauser want to add a cocking sleeve to the end of it. It really helps protect that action back there. So in terms of firing, all three had their own issues, but I was still accurate with them on range. Like, I still had a decent grouping, so it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, I feel like we're getting into the nitty-gritty so far, man.
Sure.
That we're forgiving, we're focused rather, on issues in these guns that were inherent to some of the first stuff we shot. We certainly saw some snagging with the old label. We certainly saw clips trying to jump back out of the Berthier when we filmed it back in the day, but we were focused on a smaller show, and it was sort of the first things we got into, and we were just more forgiving in general because it went bang. When we say this isn't perfect or this isn't great, it's because we now have this massive pool of comparison, and now we're starting to get a little bit up our own keisters about what we want from a World War I rifle. And in defense, we've seen things like the 1917 and the Arisaka and other designs that we haven't even filmed yet that have some impressive features. So when you have something that's smooth and beautiful, it's not always enough anymore the way we've been running these guns. Now, I agree with Mae. The dread downfall of this particular system is the fact that when we open it up, we've now externalized our cocking piece in those two planes that have to interact with each other just right to make this thing run smooth and cock on open. When we're closed, it's sealed up well enough that we're really not looking at a lot of trouble and we're not picking up a lot of muck and mud. But when we're open, it can get sucked right in there. And I agree, Mauser had the right idea by doing a cocking sleeve to cover this problem when out of battery. So there's some weaknesses. We can let in mud here, we can let in mud at the rear, and we can definitely, we know, let in mud down here, which is surprising because we already have these reinforcements on the later models after the 92 that you really could just clip over a bottom plate and a spring just like they solved with the Gewehr 88 and Car 88s, but now, last thing, just to sort of recap what Mae was talking about. N-block clip loading on this was reliable with a rimmed cartridge for the most part, but we ran a Dutch clip, like I had said, and that Dutch clip was not dialed specific to each gun. And so when we ran through this, we ran through it in the order of the Romanians and then the Portuguese, so we thought, well, maybe we just haven't gotten this Dutch clip just right, and we would play with it, and that's as good as we got it. And then, thinking we had gone completely off the rails somewhere, we put it in the Portuguese, and it ran fine. Now, the Portuguese had more wear, that could have been a factor, but the reality is that's still one of the disadvantages of that N-block system is that you are dependent on the clip, and in this case, the rim round doesn't help. You're dependent on the clip to make sure that you're feeding properly. In 1 out of 3, it seemed to work out just fine, which is also a little bit worrisome when you're really staking your life on the line. So, with that in mind, let me hand you back, I suppose that one, just because it's free-floating. I'll get the carbine out just in case we need it. Let's talk about all 3 of these one last time, and we'll get your opinion, kind of all at once, of would all or any pass the smell test for World War I? Would you take it at all? And then I guess I'd just ask you, out of the 3, which one was your favorite?
Othais did sum up my concerns fairly well. However, I will say all 3 of these guys are going to get a soft yes. I mean, I'm not a fan of the rim, but I do like that 6.5 round. It was great. Like I said, when I was firing all 3, they each had their own little hiccups here and there, but I was still on target. My shots were accurate, so I feel like I could defend myself well enough in battle with them. Now, if I were to pick my favorite, may I have the carbine? I will say the long rifle will be out because it was just longer, heavier, not quite as mobile. So it's going to be down to the carbine and the short rifle. And you know what? I don't like this sight radius quite as much, and I'm not a fan of that turn down bolt, so I think I'm going to go with the short rifle. The Portuguese is my favorite of the 3, but all 3 definitely do get a soft yes.
I think I'd concur. There's just a few variables, well, really one strong variable that seems to be kind of mucking up this process, which again is that we have an original Dutch clip. These are original Romanian and Portuguese rifles. There's always a chance that it could be down to the clip, and there's always a chance that they could have been issued better clips than that. Although, one final thought though is that you have to put, we've seen munitions problems through the war. We've seen cartridges out of spec and things like that. How firm do you believe when they're in a hurry that they're going to get the clips just right as well? So for me, again, I agree, soft yes, and I would also trend towards the short rifle. It seems to be the right balance of features from this set. Although, if you did something like get the sight further back on this little carbine, I think we'd be looking at something much more like the 6.5 Arisaka, but the Arisaka has a lot of advantages for fighting mud that this gun does not have. Now, I don't know that you're going to see Ian and Carl putting one of these into a mud test because they are some of the rarest rifles on Earth. Although I guess they could get away with it with the Portuguese style. They're a little bit more common. So I really do want to thank our donor John for sending these along. They were extreme help. And for those of you who are curious about how Mae would feel about her precious 6.5 rimmed cartridge if it were rimless, I invite you to stay around for the next episode. Alright guys, we'll see you later.
Bye everyone.
Some of you who do a bit more in-depth reading on these old guns might have noticed that this episode's notes may be one of the most complete write-ups to date on the Romanian Mannlicher rifles. I say that with some pride, but mostly worry, because that means there is a lot out there to be dug up on the adoption and issue of these guns. For my part, I've only pieced together the various notes unearthed by previous dedicated collectors and historians. And for that, I must again thank John for the loan of the guns, and our friend Vincent for some extra research and help. But a true hero did emerge to help with providing sources and material, and apply translations, and do even more heavy digging on his own, and for that I must acknowledge my co-author in this episode, Razvan. Thank you.